short while. The one name, of course, in terms of constituencies in Westminster that is always associated with Margaret Thatcher is Finchley in North London, because that's the seat that she represented from 1959, later entered the cabinet under Ted Heath in 1970 as Education Secretary. Tim Wilcox is in Finchley for us today, and he's been talking to people there who worked with Margaret Thatcher as a local MP and who knew her well. Tim?
Hugh, yeah, she was an MP here for 33 years. She stood for the seat in 1959, which she won. It was the third time she'd gone for a seat. She tried in Dartford before. She won in 1959. She stood down in 1992. And a lot of people here have known her for 50 years or more. We've been speaking to a couple earlier on who were actually on that final selection committee back in 1958. Both of them said that they didn't think a woman had any chance at all. In fact, one of them said they weren't going to vote for a woman, but she was just head and shoulders above the other two male candidates. And she got in, and then she moved up the ministerial path very quickly. Let's just talk, though, to two people associated with this seat now. Mike Freer, who's the MP for Finchley, and Marina Yannakoudakis, who's the MEP. Mike, I think for both of you, she was an inspiration. What was it like, though, taking over a seat associated so closely with Margaret Thatcher for such a long time?
Well, it will be forever Mrs Thatcher's seat, and to follow in her footsteps is a huge honour. And even today, every time I come into the building, it always reminds me that this was Mrs Thatcher's seat, and this is where she came back, you know, on a regular basis to keep in contact with local people and her activists. It kept her grounded. So
quite daunting, though, for you to take it on. Did you talk to her about that? What advice did she give you?
Well, she always said to me whenever we did have brief conversations, is that be true to yourself. And it's the one piece of advice that she gave me, is that if you're going to go into politics, believe in something and stick to it.
Marina, she had very trenchant views on Europe, but she was a European supporter, but just not as a federalist. Did you speak to her about you standing as an MEP? I think you've been an MEP for 3 years.
Yes, that's right. Well, when I got selected before the election, I actually spoke to her, and I asked her advice as to how she would deal with going into a room full of Europeans who might not necessarily be on the same wavelength as her. And she said to me, "No, Marina, you go in there and tell them how it's done."
Did you talk to her, though, about European policy? Did you have a sort of close relationship?
Well, we had more of a friendly relationship. We didn't actually talk about the ins and outs of policies. It was just generally on Europe and to be strong and with a British stance.
Mike, talking to some of the people here, they've been talking about this attention to detail, this friendliness, this warmth that perhaps people outside politics or inside politics might not have seen, certainly on a sort of public level. What are your memories of that? The fact that she would be writing notes to people. She really followed people's private lives, didn't she?
She had an enormous capacity to remember detail, even if she hadn't met someone for several years. If she bumped into them, she would know immediately who they were, or if they'd been to see her, what the issue was. And even if she'd been dealing with some international crisis, she'd remember that it was Mrs Smith's dripping tap, and that dripping tap was the most important thing in the world to Mrs Smith. And so for Mrs Thatcher, it was the most important thing in the world to deal with. And she had that amazing capacity of dealing with both international statesmen and local residents alike.
Okay, Mike Freer, Marina Yannakoudakis, thank you very much. So a lot of sadness here at the Constituency Association. As I say, there are a lot of people here who remember her right back from 1958. Thank you.
Tim, once again, thank you very much. Tim Wilcox for us in Finchley there with some of those who worked with Margaret Thatcher when she was